I want to welcome you to another video drasha. This week's Torah portion is Toldot. And here we begin these narratives of Jacob and Esau. And indeed, this portion and the next two Torah portions deal with Jacob and Esau, and these are fascinating stories and also stories that raise many problems, particularly about the character of Jacob. But in order to understand these portions that are coming, we need to keep one thing in mind, and that is that Jacob and Esau are not just individuals, but they represent nations. And indeed, the Torah tells us this explicitly in today's Torah portion. Rebekah goes because she's having a difficult pregnancy. She goes to inquire of the Lord, and she's told explicitly, there are two nations inside of you. And she's even told that these two nations are going to strive with one another. So this is not a midrash. It's not just an interpretation. The Torah is explicit that Jacob and Esau represent nations. Of course, Jacob represents Israel. His name is going to be changed to Israel. And Esau in the Torah is identified with the nation of Edom, but ultimately in rabbinic literature, Esau is going to be identified with Rome and ultimately with Christian civilization. So this really is a key to understanding these stories, that Jacob and Esau are nations and not just individuals. Now, a verse in this week's portion, which I've always found very troubling and problematic, is we are told the following. The Torah says that Isaac loved Esau because he had game in his mouth, but Rebekah loved Jacob. Now, what does this mean that Isaac loved Esau because he had game in his mouth? Well, we know that Esau was a hunter, and apparently Isaac liked the taste of fresh meat. So he favored Esau, who could bring him meat to eat. That would be the literal meaning of this. But again, this is quite problematic. Are we saying that Isaac, the son of Abraham, one of the three patriarchs, that his choice of which son he prefers is based on his stomach, on the fact that he likes eating fresh meat, and that's why he prefers Esau? I mean, it just doesn't seem right. So there are several answers that we could give to this. One is based on Rashi. Rashi actually looks at the expression here that there was game in his mouth. The word for game really is the Hebrew word for trapping. Remember that hunting in biblical times was trapping. Hunting and trapping are the same word in Hebrew. And so Rashi takes these words quite literally. And he says that Esau was trapping Isaac in his mouth. Okay, instead of game was in his mouth, rather trapping him with his mouth. And that is to say that Esau pretended to be a very pious, a sort of super observant person. And as a matter of fact, he would ask Isaac ridiculous questions about halacha, things like, oh, how do we tithe salt or straw, which are things that don't need to be tithed at all. But it made Esau look as if he were some super punctilious, observant Jew. And in this way, he tricked Isaac. Now, why is it that Rebekah wasn't tricked? Well, because Isaac grew up in the house of Abraham. He was used to being with honest people. But Rebekah grew up in the house of Laban, who we're going to find out in the next couple of Torah portions, he's really an expert at conniving and tricking. So Rebecca was very wary of people like that, and she saw right away that Esau was simply putting on an act. And that's why she knew that Jacob was the son through whom the covenantal tradition would be passed rather than Esau. So that's one potential answer. I also heard from Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, alav shalom. I have to say that Rabbi Sachs, the former chief rabbi of the British Commonwealth, unfortunately just passed away. We will speak about him in an upcoming drasha, but just to now say something in his name, in his memory, that he made an argument that, oftentimes parents will prefer a child who is more problematic. Parents can have two children. One is the perfect child, does great in school, never gets into trouble, just really a model child. And they can have another child who is in trouble, gets into trouble, has all kinds of issues. And sometimes that leads the parents actually to favor that child. And Rabbi Sachs suggests that maybe that's why Isaac preferred Esau, because he was the more troubling or more troubled child, and therefore Isaac actually preferred him. I actually prefer another explanation, and that is, I think that we can say that Isaac saw a great potential in Esau. When Esau is born, the Torah goes out of its way to make the point that he was reddish in color. Well, there's one other biblical character who is described as being reddish in color, and that was King David. So what we see here is a certain comparison between King David and Esau. And what I think we can see from this is that Esau had the potential to become a great person, just as King David did. Now, I think it was either a week or 2 weeks ago that we spoke about the fact that there is an idea that great people have an especially strong Yetzer Hara, that great people have a very strong evil inclination. In fact, what makes a person great is precisely the fact that he has to struggle to overcome his own nature. It's not that a great person is someone who's born, he's never tempted, he doesn't have any desires or impulses that would lead him astray. No, quite the contrary. Great people have even stronger impulses and desires, and it is precisely the fact that they struggle to overcome those things that's what makes them great. And we see that certainly in the case of King David, who we know he wasn't just an innocent person. The Bible speaks specifically of how he gave in to his impulse and desire with Bathsheba. So David has to struggle to overcome his character to become King David, the great figure, King David. And so the fact that the Torah makes this comparison between Esau and David perhaps is to lead us to this idea that Esau had the potential, just like King David did, to become a great person if he could overcome his Yetzer Hara, his evil inclination. The problem is that Esau didn't, and so he didn't become the great figure. But somehow Isaac saw that potential in him, and that was why he preferred Esau. And so I think that this is another great lesson in this idea that life is about struggle. And certainly when it comes to Jacob, we're going to see in this Torah portion, in next week's Torah portion, and in the following week's Torah portion, that Jacob also has a character where he has to overcome many problems. He certainly is not someone who was born perfect. he also has to struggle to become Jacob, who ultimately will become Israel. So, with those thoughts in mind, I hope everyone will read the Torah portion this week, and we will continue talking about Jacob and Esau in the coming weeks. Good Shabbos.